My name is Renata Kessler. I'm 47. 22 years ago, I married a man named Dale in a small chapel outside Tulsa, Oklahoma. 3 weeks ago, my sister sent me a text from a beach in Puerto Vallarta that read, "We're not coming back. I'm sorry, but I'm not." The "we" in that text was Dale. Before I tell you what happened at the courthouse 6 weeks later, the part that made even my own lawyer go quiet, let me take you back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without understanding exactly how long I'd been building the life someone else decided to walk away with. If you're the kind of person who sees a story through to the end instead of skipping ahead, go ahead and subscribe, only if you actually mean it. And tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I read every comment. I run a small accounting firm out of a converted house in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. 3 employees and a client list I built one referral at a time over 18 years. Dale worked in commercial insurance, the kind of steady, respectable career that let us build a comfortable, unremarkable life. A 4-bedroom house, 2 kids now grown and out of state, a lake cabin we'd paid off 2 years ago. My younger sister, Wendy, is 42. She'd been divorced twice, lived 40 minutes away in Owasso, and had, for the better part of a decade, orbited our family in the particular way some siblings do. Always around for holidays, always borrowing small amounts of money just until payday, always somehow the one everyone worried about, while I was the one everyone assumed was fine. I should say clearly, I loved my sister. Whatever came later doesn't erase the fact that for most of my adult life, I genuinely believed we were close. It started, as these things usually do, in small increments. I didn't notice until much later. About 14 months before that text, Wendy started coming around more. She'd stop by on weekday afternoons when Dale worked from home, bringing coffee, staying to chat. I thought it was sweet. Wendy finally settling into a steadier rhythm, spending more time with family instead of chasing whatever crisis had defined her 20s and 30s. I noticed Dale seemed lighter during those months, in a way I credited, foolishly, to a good stretch at work. He laughed more. He started going to the gym again after years of talking about it without following through. He got a haircut he hadn't changed in a decade. I told my book club I felt like I was getting my husband back from some invisible slump. I had no idea I was describing, in real time, a man falling for someone else. Around the 8-month mark, small financial oddities started appearing that I chalked up to nothing. A hotel charge in Tulsa on a weeknight Dale said was a client dinner that ran late. A jewelry store charge he explained as a gift for me that never materialized. When I asked about it 3 weeks later, he said he'd returned it because he didn't like how it looked in person. I run an accounting firm. I reconcile discrepancies for a living. And somehow, I spent months explaining away the exact kind of pattern I'd have flagged immediately in any client's books. 6 weeks before the text, my sister came to my house on a Sunday afternoon while Dale was at the lake cabin, getting it ready for the season. She sat at my kitchen table, drank the coffee I made her, and asked me, casually, almost lightly, whether Dale and I had ever considered separating. "Why would you ask that?" I said. "No reason. Marriages just change over time, don't they? 22 years is a long time." I remember laughing it off, telling her Dale and I were fine, that every long marriage had quiet stretches. She smiled, nodded, and changed the subject to something about her upcoming trip with a girlfriend from her old gym. I didn't think about that conversation again until much later, when I realized she hadn't been asking out of curiosity. She'd been testing the ground before she pulled it out from under me entirely. 4 weeks before the text, Dale told me he needed to attend an out-of-state insurance conference in Dallas. 3 days, standard for his job, something he'd done a dozen times over the years without incident. Around the same time, Wendy mentioned she was taking a solo trip to Mexico with a girlfriend, her first real vacation, she said, in years. She'd been saving up, she told our mother, working extra shifts at her part-time retail job to afford it. I have gone back over those 2 conversations more times than I can count, trying to identify the exact moment I should have connected them. I never did. Why would I? My husband was going to Dallas for work. My sister was going to Mexico with a friend. These were two unrelated facts about two people I loved, filed away without a second thought. Dale left for his conference on a Tuesday morning. Wendy left for Mexico that same Thursday, according to the group text she sent our extended family, with a beach emoji and a countdown. I didn't hear from Dale on Wednesday, which was unusual but not alarming. Conferences run long, phones die, time zones complicate things. I didn't hear from him Thursday either. By Friday morning, 3 days into radio silence from a man who normally texted me good morning every single day of our marriage, I started calling his phone every hour. It went straight to voicemail every time. I called the hotel listed on his conference itinerary, the one he'd mentioned before leaving. The front desk had no reservation under his name for that week. I called his office. His assistant, sounding confused, told me there was no insurance conference in Dallas that week at all. The last one on the company calendar had been 2 months earlier. I sat at my kitchen table with my phone in my hand, the same table where Wendy had asked me 6 weeks earlier whether Dale and I had ever considered separating, and felt something cold and enormous settling into my chest. That Friday evening, at 6:47 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from a number I recognized instantly as my sister's. I opened it standing in my kitchen, still in the blazer I'd worn to work that day, and read 11 words that rearranged the entire architecture of my life in under 3 seconds. Dale and I are together. We're not coming back. I'm sorry. I read it 4 times before the words fully assembled themselves into something my brain could process. My husband. My sister. Together. Not a business trip. Not a girlfriend's beach vacation. The same trip. The same beach. Apparently the same room. Well, I'd spent 3 days calling hotels and offices trying to figure out why my husband of 22 years had gone silent. I didn't cry immediately. What I did instead, and I've thought about this a lot since, was walk to my home office, sit down at my desk, and open my laptop to the joint bank accounts Dale and I had shared for over 2 decades. What I found in the next 10 minutes made the betrayal of the affair feel, temporarily, like the smaller problem. My hands moved almost mechanically across the keyboard, the way they do when I'm reviewing a client's books instead of my own life. 22 years of shared banking history sat in front of me, and for the first time, I wasn't looking at it as a wife. I was looking at it as an accountant who suddenly suspected fraud. The joint checking account looked normal at first glance. Mortgage payment, utilities, groceries, the usual rhythm of a household. But when I pulled up the last 4 months of statements side by side, a pattern emerged that made my stomach twist. Cash withdrawals. Small ones at first. 200 here, 300 there, always from ATMs near Dale's office, always timed for early afternoon. Then larger ones. A $4,000 withdrawal 11 weeks ago, logged simply as personal. A $6,500 transfer to an account I didn't recognize, made 9 weeks ago, the same week Wendy had sat at my kitchen table asking if Dale and I had ever considered separating. I opened our joint investment account next, the one holding what I'd always considered a real safety net. 18 years of retirement contributions, conservative but steady growth. The kind of account you don't touch unless something is seriously wrong. 2 months ago, Dale had liquidated nearly 40% of it. The withdrawal request bore his signature, processed through an online portal I rarely logged into, because he'd always handled that account personally, insisting it was his area since he understood market timing better than I did. I trusted that division of labor for 2 decades, without ever fully verifying it myself. 40% of 18 years of retirement savings gone into an account transfer I couldn't trace from where I was sitting at 7:15 p.m., alone in my kitchen, my sister's text still glowing on my phone screen beside my laptop. I called our financial advisor's after-hours line and left a voicemail so calm it frightened me afterward, listening to my own recorded voice asking her to call me back immediately regarding unauthorized activity on a joint account. Then I did something I'm not proud of, but that I understood even in the moment I needed to do. I called my son, Ethan, 24, living in Denver, and told him everything in 4 sentences. Flatly, the way you'd report a car accident. He was quiet for a long moment, then said the thing that ended up mattering more than anything else that night. "Mom, I think you need to call Aunt Carol before you call anyone else." Carol was Dale's older sister, sharp, retired from a career in family law, someone I'd always liked but never had wasn't to lean on. Ethan's instinct, it turned out, was better than mine that night. Carol picked up on the second ring, and when I read her my sister's text out loud, her only reaction was a long, controlled exhale. "Renata, listen to me very carefully. Do not touch anything else on those accounts tonight. Do not call Dale. Do not call your sister. Screenshot everything you found right now before anything can be altered or deleted, and email it to yourself and to me. Tomorrow morning, first thing, you're calling a divorce attorney, not a marriage counselor. This isn't a marriage that ended. Based on what you're describing, this looks like it was planned." "Planned? Carol, that's my sister. I know," she said quietly. "I'm sorry, but 40% of a retirement account doesn't disappear by accident 2 months before someone announces they're leaving with your husband. People don't liquidate investments for a fling. They liquidate investments when they're preparing to disappear with something I sent. That entire night, documenting everything, the way I document evidence for a client audit. Screenshots, timestamps, transaction histories, a growing spreadsheet of every irregular withdrawal going back 6 months. By 4 a.m., I had built a financial timeline that told a story far more calculated than husband falls for wife's sister on a beach vacation. The withdrawals had started roughly the same week Wendy began her casual afternoon visits. The larger transfers escalated in the weeks immediately following her pointed question about separation. Whatever this was, it hadn't happened in 3 days in Mexico. It had been assembled, quietly, for over a year. The attorney Carol referred me to, a woman named Diane Ferris, met with me 2 days later. I brought my spreadsheet, my screenshots, and copies of every statement I could access. She read through it in near silence for almost 40 minutes. "Mrs. Kessler," she finally said, "I want to be direct with you. Based on the timeline you've documented, I believe your husband engaged in what's legally considered dissipation of marital assets, moving or spending shared funds in anticipation of divorce, specifically to reduce what you'd be entitled to in a settlement. Combined with the timing of these transfers relative to his disappearance, this isn't just an affair complicating a divorce. This looks like a financial exit strategy that happened to include an affair, not the other way around. You think he planned this? Financially, I mean." "I think," she said carefully, "that we need to find out exactly where that liquidated retirement money went, and fast, before it disappears further into accounts that are harder to trace. I'm filing for an emergency asset freeze on your remaining joint accounts this afternoon, and I want a forensic accountant brought in immediately to trace where that 40% actually landed." I didn't hear from Dale directly for another 11 days. When he finally called, from a number I didn't recognize, his voice sounded strange, apologetic in a rehearsed way, like he'd practiced the call in a mirror. "Renata, I know you're upset, but I need you to understand this wasn't planned. It just happened. Wendy and I... Where's the money, Dale?" Silence. 40% of our retirement account. $6,500 in a transfer to an account I don't recognize. Cash withdrawals going back 6 months. Where is it? "It's not what you think. Some of that was for the trip. Some was for the trip you told me was a Dallas insurance conference." He didn't answer that either. "I have a lawyer now, Dale. I have a forensic accountant tracing every dollar. I have 11 months of financial records that tell a very different story than this just happened. So before you say anything else, I'd think very carefully about what you say next. Because I promise you, whatever you tell me right now, I'm going to be able to verify against the paper trail within a week.
There was a long pause, long enough that I could hear waves in the background. And then, quietly, almost defeated, "You should talk to Wendy. There's more to this than what you're seeing in the accounts." "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, "that the money wasn't entirely my idea." He hung up before I could ask anything else, leaving me standing in my kitchen with my phone in my hand, for the second time in 2 weeks, staring at a silence that told me the story I thought I understood was about to get considerably more complicated. Diane Ferris called me the following morning, before I'd even finished my coffee, her voice carrying the particular sharpness of someone who'd found something significant. "Renata, the forensic accountant traced the $6,500 transfer. I want you sitting down for this." I'm sitting. "It went to an LLC registered 8 months ago. The registered agent on that LLC is your sister, Wendy." I set my coffee down very carefully, like the mug itself might shatter if I moved too fast. An LLC. My sister created a business? A property holding company, specifically. And here's the part that matters. 3 weeks after that LLC was formed, it purchased a small condo unit in Puerto Vallarta. Cash purchase, no mortgage. The down payment, along with additional funds over the following months, traces directly back to withdrawals from your joint accounts. The room seemed to tilt slightly. They bought property with my retirement money. Before they even left? Based on the timeline, yes. This wasn't two people falling in love and impulsively deciding to run away together. This was, at minimum, 8 months of financial planning, structured specifically to move marital assets into an entity your sister controlled, ahead of announcing anything to you. I thought about every afternoon Wendy had spent at my kitchen table over the past year, drinking my coffee, asking casual questions, while quietly helping structure the dismantling of my marriage and my retirement savings in parallel. "Diane, is this something we can actually get back?" That's exactly what we're going to fight for. Since the LLC was funded substantially with marital assets, and since the transfers occurred without your knowledge or consent during an act of marriage, we have a strong argument for both asset recovery and, frankly, a much larger settlement in your favor to account for the dissipation. I'm also going to recommend we loop in a fraud attorney separately, because depending on how deliberately this was structured, there may be grounds for a civil claim against your sister directly, independent of the divorce. Against Wendy? She's not even married to Dale. This is a divorce case. Your sister knowingly received and used marital funds she wasn't legally entitled to purchase property she now holds title to. That's not automatically covered under standard divorce proceedings. It may require its own action entirely. Over the following 4 weeks, the case built itself into something far larger than the simple, if painful, story I'd assumed at the start. A husband's affair, a standard divorce. The forensic accountant uncovered a second, smaller LLC, this one in Wendy's name alone, that had received consulting fees from Dale's insurance business over the prior year. Payments that, on paper, looked like legitimate business expenses, but that corresponded suspiciously well with the timeline of the affair. Wendy, it turned out, had been quietly siphoning money from 2 directions at once, pulling from our joint household accounts through Dale, while also extracting smaller amounts directly from his business under the guise of consulting work she'd never actually performed. My mother, when I finally told her everything, went nearly silent on the phone for almost a full minute. "Renata, I need to tell you something, and I should have paid closer attention to it months ago. Wendy asked me for a loan back in the spring, $8,000, she said, for a business opportunity she wouldn't fully explain. I gave it to her because she's my daughter, and she said she was finally getting her life together. I think that was seed money for whatever this LLC turned out to be. $8,000 from our mother, money withdrawn from our joint accounts, consulting fees from Dale's business. My sister had apparently built her exit strategy from at least 3 separate funding sources over the better part of a year, all while sitting at my table, drinking my coffee, asking whether my marriage had changed over time.
The court date arrived 6 weeks after that first text on the beach. Dale's attorney tried, in the opening arguments, to frame the case as a straightforward divorce complicated by an unfortunate affair, asking the court to treat the retirement withdrawal as a mutual decision I'd simply forgotten agreeing to, a claim my documented spreadsheet and the forensic accountant's testimony dismantled within the first hour. What no one in that courtroom expected, including, I later learned, Dale himself, was that Diane had spent the prior week working with the fraud attorney to build a parallel civil case against Wendy directly, based on the consulting fee scheme and the LLC funding trail. She'd filed it quietly, timed to surface precisely when Dale's attorney tried to argue the money had simply been relocated, rather than deliberately hidden. When Diane introduced the second LLC, the one tied to fabricated consulting fees from Dale's business, and laid out document by document exactly how Wendy had extracted money from 2 separate sources over nearly a year, I watched Dale's face change in real time. He glanced toward his own attorney with an expression I hadn't seen from him in over 2 decades of marriage. Genuine, unguarded shock. "Your Honor," Diane said, closing her presentation, "the evidence shows a pattern of asset dissipation planned and executed over approximately 11 months, involving both a retirement account and a business entity, with funds routed to a third party who has now taken title to real property purchased substantially with marital assets. My client is requesting not only an equitable distribution that accounts for this dissipation, but a constructive trust be placed over the Puerto Vallarta property pending full resolution of the related civil action." The judge, a woman with an unreadable expression through most of the proceedings, finally looked directly at Dale. "Mr. Kessler, is there anything you'd like to add regarding the extent of your awareness of these transactions?" Dale sat very still for a long moment, then said something that answered a question I hadn't even realized I was still asking myself. "Your Honor, I knew about the retirement transfer. I didn't fully understand, until recently, exactly how much of this Wendy had structured on her own, using accounts and paperwork I didn't look at closely enough. It wasn't quite a confession, but it wasn't nothing either. For the first time since that text arrived on my phone 6 weeks earlier, I understood that the man I'd been married to for 22 years might not have been the primary architect of this at all, just a willing, careless participant in a plan someone else had built, someone who'd spent a year sitting across from me at my own kitchen table. The court recessed for lunch after Dale's admission, and I spent the break sitting in a hallway with Diane, my hands wrapped around a coffee I wasn't drinking, trying to process what I'd just watched. My husband hadn't just been unfaithful. He'd been, by his own admission, careless enough to let someone else quietly restructure our shared life without fully understanding the mechanics himself. "Diane, be honest with me. How bad does this look for Wendy now?" "Considerably worse than it looked for her an hour ago," she said. "Dale just testified, essentially, that he didn't structure this alone and didn't fully understand the extent of what your sister built. That doesn't excuse him, but it does shift a significant amount of scrutiny onto her financial conduct specifically. Conduct that, unlike his, isn't protected under standard marital dissolution law, because she was never your spouse." When proceedings resumed that afternoon, Diane called the forensic accountant to the stand, a methodical man named Everett Cho, who walked the court through 11 months of transactions with the kind of dispassionate clarity that made the pattern impossible to argue with. Dates, amounts, account numbers, the formation of the first LLC 9 months before the affair became public, the consulting fee scheme running parallel to it, the Puerto Vallarta property purchase, timed almost exactly to the week Dale claimed his insurance conference. Wendy's attorney, a younger man who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the afternoon wore on, attempted to argue that the consulting fees represented legitimate business services rendered, but Everett had already anticipated that defense. He produced Dale's own company calendar and email records, obtained through discovery, showing no meetings, no deliverables, no communication of any kind connected to the supposed consulting arrangement beyond the invoices themselves. In 11 months of alleged consulting work, Everett testified, I found 0 corresponding work product, 0 meeting records, and 0 email correspondence discussing project scope, deliverables, or outcomes. The invoices exist. The underlying services do not appear to. By late afternoon, the judge's patience with Wendy's attorney's objections had visibly thinned. When Diane moved to formally request the constructive trust over the Puerto Vallarta property, arguing that title should be frozen pending resolution of the separate fraud claim, the judge granted it without significant hesitation, noting for the record that the pattern of financial conduct described today raises questions this court cannot simply set aside as a private family matter. I hadn't expected, walking into that courthouse that morning, to watch my sister's carefully built exit plan dismantled piece by piece by an accountant's spreadsheet and a husband's unplanned honesty. I also hadn't expected the moment that came next, during a brief recess, when Wendy approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom, her composure finally cracking for the first time since any of this began. "Renata, please, can we just talk? Just the two of us?" I looked at her for a long moment. My younger sister, the one I'd bailed out of 2 divorces, 3 job losses, and more small financial emergencies than I could count over the years. The one who'd sat at my kitchen table asking if my marriage had changed, while quietly funding a property purchase with money pulled from my retirement account. "What is there to talk about, Wendy? Everett just walked the entire courtroom through 11 months of paperwork. What exactly do you want to explain?" Her eyes filled, and for a moment I almost felt the old reflex kick in, the lifetime habit of softening for her, smoothing things over, being the responsible older sister who forgave whatever needed forgiving to keep the peace. "I know how it looks," she said, "but Dale and I, we really did fall for each other. The money, I know it looks calculated, but I was scared, Renata. I've never had anything of my own. Not a house, not savings, nothing steady. When this started with Dale, I panicked, thinking about what happens to me if it ends and I have nothing to show for it. I made bad decisions. I'm not saying they weren't bad, but it wasn't some cold, calculated plan from the beginning. I was just trying to protect myself." I thought about the $8,000 our mother had given her in the spring for a vague business opportunity. I thought about the consulting invoices with no corresponding work. I thought about 9 months of LLC paperwork, structured and filed, long before any beach text arrived on my phone. "Wendy, you built a legal entity to receive money from my marriage 9 months before you left with my husband. That's not panic, that's planning. I understand being scared of having nothing. I don't understand deciding the solution was taking from me specifically, quietly, for the better part of a year, while sitting in my kitchen." She didn't have an answer for that. She stood in that hallway, crying, and for the first time in our entire lives, I didn't move toward her to make it easier. "I hope you get your case sorted out," I said. "I mean that. But I'm not going to pretend the last 11 months were a mistake you stumbled into. You built this. I need you to understand that I finally see that clearly, and I'm not going back to pretending otherwise just because it would be simpler for both of us." I walked back into the courtroom without waiting for her response, and for the first time in 6 weeks, I felt something other than grief settle into the space where my old life used to be. Not peace exactly, something closer to clarity, the specific, hard-won clarity of finally seeing a person exactly as they are, instead of who you've spent your whole life needing them to be. The judge scheduled a follow-up hearing for the full asset division and the fraud case 6 weeks out, giving both sides time to gather additional documentation on the consulting fee scheme and the property trust. As I walked out of the courthouse that evening, Diane beside me, I understood that the hardest part of this, the financial reckoning, the legal untangling, was still ahead of me. But the part that had felt unbearable 3 weeks earlier, standing alone in my kitchen reading 11 words on a phone screen, had already, somehow, started to feel survivable. 6 weeks later, I sat in that same courtroom for the follow-up hearing, though I barely recognized the woman who'd first walked in there back in June. That version of me had been reeling, discovering the depth of a betrayal in real time, one bank statement at a time. The woman who returned in August had spent 6 weeks rebuilding herself around a set of facts instead of a set of assumptions, and it turned out that was a sturdier place to stand. Everett Cho's follow-up report had uncovered one final piece neither Diane nor I had anticipated. The Puerto Vallarta condo, now frozen under the constructive trust, had actually been assessed at nearly double what the LLC paid for it, meaning that even after full restitution of the marital funds used to purchase it, there would be meaningful equity left over. Equity the court now had to decide how to divide, given the fraud findings against Wendy. The judge, reviewing the accumulated evidence from both the divorce proceeding and the parallel civil fraud case Diane's colleague had built, didn't mince words in her ruling. This court finds a clear and sustained pattern of financial dissipation, beginning approximately 11 months prior to the dissolution of this marriage, involving the deliberate structuring of marital assets into an entity controlled by a third party. The court awards Mrs. Kessler full equitable distribution, reflecting the dissipated retirement funds, plus prejudgment interest, to be satisfied first from the equity in the Puerto Vallarta property before any remaining proceeds are distributed to the named LLC. In plain terms, I got my retirement money back, with interest, taken directly from the sale of the property my husband and sister had purchased with it. The consulting fee scheme, once fully documented, resulted in a separate civil judgment against Wendy personally, since Dale's business had never actually received any services in return for the money paid out. Dale, for his part, avoided criminal referral only because Diane and I ultimately agreed, after long consideration, not to pursue that route. Not out of forgiveness, but out of exhaustion, and a recognition that 22 years of shared history, however it had ended, didn't need to end in a criminal courtroom on top of everything else. The civil judgment and the divorce settlement were enough. I needed the chapter closed, not extended indefinitely. My mother took Wendy's actions harder than I expected, in a direction I hadn't anticipated. She didn't defend her. She called me 2 days after the final ruling and said, quietly, I gave her $8,000 in the spring because I believed she was finally building something real. I keep thinking about how easily I believed her, the same way you did. I don't know how to feel about that yet, except that I'm sorry, and I should have asked more questions. Wendy and I haven't spoken since that hallway conversation outside the courtroom. I don't know if we ever will again, not in any real way. I've made peace with that slower than I expected to, in pieces, on ordinary days rather than in any single dramatic moment. Driving to work, cooking dinner alone in a kitchen that used to hold 3 place settings out of habit, before I finally stopped setting the third one. I sold the house 8 months after the ruling. Not out of necessity. The settlement left me in a stable position. More stable, honestly, than I'd expected given how the story started. But because I didn't want to keep living inside a floor plan built around a marriage that had quietly been dismantled from underneath me for the better part of a year before I ever found out. I bought a smaller place, closer to my firm, put half the restored retirement funds into a more conservative long-term account, and started, slowly, rebuilding a version of stability that belonged entirely to me. Ethan calls more now than he used to, checking in without needing an excuse. My mother and I have grown closer, in an unexpected way, both of us navigating what it means to have trusted someone completely and been wrong, together, instead of separately. I think often about the version of that Friday evening where I might have called Dale first, might have let him explain his way past my questions before I'd built the spreadsheet, before Carol told me to document everything, before Diane traced the LLC. I think about how close I came to accepting the smaller, simpler story, an affair, a painful but ordinary divorce, instead of the far larger, more calculated truth that had been assembling itself in the background of my life for nearly a year. I run my accounting firm the same way I always have, except now, when a client comes to me confused about a discrepancy they can't quite explain, I understand something in my bones I only used to understand on paper, that the numbers rarely lie, even when the people attached to them do. Somewhere behind every irregular withdrawal, every unexplained transfer, Every account you stopped checking closely because you trusted the person managing it, there's a story waiting to be reconciled, whether you're ready to look at it or not.
I was ready, eventually. It cost me a marriage, a sister, and 11 months I'll never fully get back. But it also gave me something I hadn't expected to find on the other side of that beach text. A version of myself who finally trusted her own instincts as much as she'd once trusted everyone else's explanations.